Could you tell us what kind of a man Ceannt was, what in appearance?
Well, he was a very fine-looking man, well-built, very dark eyes, he had a moustache, and he was a man that you would stand to look at if you saw him on the street. Of course, he was well known in Dublin because he used to play the bagpipes and in various other Irish Island functions. But he was certainly a splendid figure of a man, a fine-looking fellow.
Out of the 7 signatories, by far the least well known is Eamonn Ceannt, but he had probably the most relatable life. A man with many talents who was bogged down by 17 years as an accountancy clerk. A musician with a wife and kids who is by far the most earnest and soldierly of the bunch. Born as Ned Thomas Ceannt in the police barracks in Galway, his father was a policeman who had to regularly deal with violence and intimidation from evicted farmers. Ceannt was 2 when his father was promoted and the family moved to County Louth and he was sent to the Christian Brothers School in Drogheda. He was intensely shy and quiet. He loved fishing in the countryside with his brothers and could mimic bird calls with great accuracy. He loved going to the circus and was extremely keen on general knowledge. The countryside life ended when he was 11 and the father moved the family to North Dublin and Ceannt was sent to another Christian Brothers School named after Daniel O'Connell. Ceannt was stoic and academic. He grew to be very, very serious and took his work very seriously. He won many exhibitions and school prizes, only dropping off for a bit at 13 when his mother suddenly died. But he was still earnest. According to his brother Michael, when their mother died, the young Ceannt simply took the bad news with, quote, silence and immobility. He was, and would always remain, a bit pretentious. As a teenager, he wrote in his school project, quote, the more we know, the more we wish to know. We are never tired of getting additional knowledge after our school days are over. He was desperate to learn anything, including languages, and whenever a foreign boat would arrive to the docks, he would go down with his friends in hope of practicing his French or German. Unlike MacDonagh and Pearce, who grew up unionist, Ceannt went to a nationalist school. Rugby was banned from the school as a foreign sport, although he still loved playing it anyways in Phoenix Park. His brother Bill was different, however, who signed up to join the British Army, with Ceannt saying, I am Irish, and no Irishman should join a foreign army. With one brother a British soldier, another a British civil servant, and his father and brother both policemen, he was certainly the black sheep, and he began being rebellious with his Irishness. He was no longer Ned, he hibernicized his name to Eamonn Ceannt. And when his brother Bill went to fight in the Boer War in 1899, Ceannt put up a Boer flag in the family garden, until his father ripped it out of the ground. He passed his school exams with excellent results, but when his father pushed him to join the civil service, he rejected it because, in his eyes, it was British. He went for a job interview for a journalist with the Irish Independent, and once wrote that the pen is mightier than the sword, but he turned down the job as he didn't like the night hours. Instead, he took up a job as a clerk in Dublin City's finance office, working as an accountant. In the 17 years he worked there, he was late only once, according to his wife, because a storm blew him off his bike. But Ceannt's talent was wasted sitting in an office. As one colleague said, a brain such as his, always crowded with ideas, novel and interesting, seemed to chafe at the humdrum of routine and sameness. In 1899, he came across a book called Simple Lessons in Irish by Father O'Growney from the Gaelic League. Ceannt began teaching himself Irish from the book, and like every Irish nationalist of the time, he got involved in the organisation. A few months later, he joined the Dublin Central Branch of the Gaelic League, where he met Owen MacNeill, and, most importantly, Padraig Pearse. Ceannt's brains helped him yet again, and after just over a year, he was teaching Irish there. He then found out for the first time his father was actually a native Irish speaker, but he hid it from his children so that he could have better opportunities speaking English. This further radicalised Ceannt. He was now fluent in Irish and spent his holidays in the Gaeltacht in the West, just like Pearse, MacDonagh, Plunkett and so many others, and just like Pearse, he never drank or smoked. Ceannt was promoted to the Gaelic League branch committee in Dublin, where he was made secretary and head of a local branch. He was a blessing to them, as he was willing to put away all romanticisation and do all the boring admin and organisation work. But Ceannt's real talent had always been music, as he was fantastic at the fiddle, tin whistle and bagpipes. He may have been a very serious man, but when it came to performing, one contemporary said Ceannt was, quote, full of dash and fire. He played the bagpipes at the St. Patrick's Day parade in 1902, and was disgusted to find his fellow Gaelic Leaguers drinking during the day in the pubs. The Gaelic League also brought him into contact with the love of his life. When he was only 19, he met a woman named Frances O'Brennan from Galway, although she changed her name to Aine. Aine said she was initially attracted to him, not by his masculinity, his music, or his moustache, but she was attracted to him by his whistling, which she said was wonderful, and, quote, sweet as a bird on a bush, end quote. And 2 years later, he proposed, asking her to be his little wife and for him to be her protector, and they had a happy countryside home where they had chickens and grew vegetables. His brother died of TB 2 years later, just before Eamonn and Aine's wedding, which was held entirely in Irish. One of his friends living in London wrote back home congratulating him, quote, "Shy, bashful, retiring Ned, who used to blush when asked the boundaries of Europe. Not merely engaged, mind you, but married. Well, I'm blowed. I really am." Aine nearly died the next year giving birth to their only child, Ronan, who Ceannt spoke only Irish to at home. He became a master of the language, and by 1906 he was teaching Irish along with Pearse as an evening job at the new Leinster College of Irish. One bizarre episode that stands out in Ceannt's life was in 1908 when he visited the Vatican as the official piper of the Catholic Young Men's Society. Ceannt's only holidays up to that point were to the Gaeltacht, but he could not resist the temptation to see Pope Pius X. He made a rule of refusing to speak English abroad, only speaking Irish, French and a little Italian, and told his fellow Irish speakers to do the same. When the boat arrived in France, he was delighted to see a large cross at the harbour in Dieppe, which was a relief to him that France wasn't a country without religion, as was commonly believed. Ceannt and the Irish Brigade met the Pope, where he played O'Donnell Abu, to which the Pope was delighted and asked for another song, and Ceannt then played The Wearing of the Green, which made the newspapers back home, much to Ceannt's annoyance, as a very secretive man. When he returned home, he jumped right back into nationalism and joined Sinn Féin the next year, and by the end of that year, he was on the Sinn Féin National Council. Clearly he did well wherever he went. Just at the end of 1911, Ceannt was officially sworn into the IRB by Sean McDiarmid, who he met earlier that year at the Sinn Féin headquarters, and 3 months later he was working for Pearse's short-lived newspaper called An Bar Bua. While Clark and McDiarmid were like father and son, and Plunkett, Pearse and MacDonagh close friends, Ceannt was always a bit of an outsider, but they still valued him immensely for his serious, hard work ethic. He was trusted by McDiarmid quickly, and by June 1912, Ceannt had his own gun. In November 1913, the Irish Volunteers were founded by Eoin MacNeill, and shortly after, Ceannt was appointed Director of Communications in the Volunteers. The Volunteers were quickly infiltrated by the IRB by Tom Clark, right under MacNeill's nose. Ceannt was promoted to the IRB Military Council, and in the Volunteers he was appointed Commandant of the 4th Battalion of the Dublin Brigade. Perhaps Ceannt's earnestness is best summed up by the O'Donovan Rossa funeral, where Pearse gave possibly the most famous speech in Irish history, declaring that Ireland unfree shall never be at peace. While thousands were enthralled and spoke about it for decades after, of course Ceannt was not impressed with Pearse's tear-jerking romanticism. Sinn Féin member Darrell Figgis spoke of Ceannt, quote, with cold contempt of Padraig Pearse's slow and moving eloquence and appeal to sentiment as green flaggery. He would have none of it. It revolted his pride. By Good Friday, the leaders were happy. Ceannt confided to a friend that he was eating and sleeping well and looking hugely forward to the rising, saying, "We are rising on Sunday and we are going to win. We are going to bring off something unprecedented in the way of revolutions. We are going to smash the bloody old empire." Until Eoin MacNeill sent out cancellation orders to try stop the rising. Pearse, Plunkett, McDiarmid and MacDonagh went to speak to MacNeill. Clark called MacNeill's cancellation order, quote, the blackest and most treacherous betrayal. Ceannt went further and said MacNeill should be shot, but none of the other leaders agreed with him. That night he returned home to find his siblings Michael and Nell with the news that their brother's wife had died that morning in childbirth, and they wanted Ceannt to come with them to visit him. Ceannt, being Ceannt, refused to go with them to condole his brother, the policeman, and instead went with Aine to Hout in Kerry. One woman from Cumann, Moira Ní Shívlig, who was a friend of MacDonagh's, gave this description of how soldierly Ceannt was. Quote, I stayed with the Ceants all day. That evening at tea, Eamon, dark, quiet, reserved as he always was, seemed preoccupied with thoughts of his own. He seemed to have withdrawn into himself. He did not join to any great extent in the talk which went on during the meal. Afterwards, he asked for a fire in a separate room and withdrew. As I shook hands, Eamon came out to the front room. He looked tired and strained. Goodbye, Moira, he said. I never saw him again. The Irish Proclamation was printed out Saturday night in Liberty Hall, but Ceannt was asleep that evening at 5 o'clock when a messenger was sent for him to come. He broke his lifetime of punctuality when he hopped on his bicycle to race to Liberty Hall 3.5 hours late, to have his name printed on the legendary proclamation.
Did you know Eamonn Ceannt?
I met him afterwards in the Gaelic League. He taught me Irish in the Gaelic League.
What was he like as a teacher?
Oh, very good teacher, but I never saw him smiling. Very sedate.
Separated from the other leaders in legacy, he was the same Easter week. Ceannt's 4th Dublin Battalion seized control of South Dublin Union with about 100 men, one of whom his second-in-command, Cathal Brugha, who was just as serious as him, and W.T. Cosgrave, who would succeed Michael Collins. Wearing a regular volunteer uniform and an Australian bushranger hat, Ceannt led the march to seize the massive building where they were vastly underpopulated. On the first day, the western part of the building was overwhelmed by 300 British soldiers, but Ceannt's men fought on and miraculously lasted the whole day. One volunteer said Ceannt, quote, moved about as if he had an enchanted life. As a result of their success, the British withdrew and didn't return until Thursday, during which time they had set up a good fortress. Ceannt arranged for the officers and volunteers to eat together and was always, quote, cool and cheerful. Ceannt, being a staunch Christian, also planned daily confessions and led the men in the rosary during breaks in the fighting. The British returned Thursday, which saw a huge bombardment of sniper fire, where Cathal Brugha was shot 25 times, but miraculously survived, and was later spared execution, simply because they were certain he would die anyway. Later the same day, Ceannt lived up to his reputation and became the only one of the 7 leaders to kill someone during the rising, when he shot a policeman. But he was still human, and the pressure got to him that Friday. With all the constant sniper fire, machine guns and grenades, and now Brugha seemingly dead, Ceannt was found by a Red Cross man, quote, in a small room by himself, his rosary beads in his hands, and big tears rolling down his cheeks and face, end quote. Ceannt looked up and saw the Red Cross man, who quickly looked away, but Ceannt called him back in, and he, quote, buried his face in his handkerchief, and after about half a minute he was again the leader. On Sunday, the shocking news came from Thomas MacDonagh, who arrived with 2 priests to tell him he surrendered, after Pearse too had surrendered to GPO. Ceannt was horrified, but he accepted the inevitable. Although when the British officer came, he attempted to shake hands, but Ceannt refused. The officer said, "You have a fine position here," to which Ceannt replied, "Yes, and we made full use of it. Not alone did we hold your army for 6 days, but shook it to its foundation." To top it all off, as he was marching down the street next to General Lowe, with the Irish troops behind him, one said, "Eamonn looked great. He had his shirt thrown open, his tunic thrown open, and was swinging along at the head of his men. He looked like a real soldier." He was then thrown into a crowded cell, among which were Clark, McDiarmid and MacDonagh, who sat with their backs to the wall. But Ceannt, quote, defiantly strode up and down in front of them, arms folded, looking very much like a caged lion. On the 3rd and 4th of May, Ceannt fought for his life in court. At his trial, he called John MacBride to testify, which he did, and then tried to call MacDonagh to the stand, only to be told MacDonagh was shot that morning. The case was adjourned, and in his closing address, Ceannt denied assisting the enemy, meaning Germany. He knew deep down it was pointless trying to fight the inevitable. As he wrote to Aine, he expected death because, quote, "Better men have already suffered. I shall die like a man, for Ireland's sake." Aine found her home trashed by the police, but she was granted permission to visit him that Saturday. Ceannt, being Ceannt, wasted no time in his cell. He gave Aine his will and a list of notes about insurance policies, a possible grant from the Union, potential dependence funds, and a request that small tokens be given to his brothers, including Bill, who was still in the British Army, and was killed the next year in Europe. He also wrote a warning of guidance for future Irishmen who may tread the same path. Quote, "Never to treat with the enemy, never to surrender at his mercy, but to fight to a finish. I see nothing gained but grave disaster caused by the surrender which has marked the end of the Irish insurrection of 1916, so far at least as Dublin is concerned." The last sentence shows Ceannt was never swayed by the romantic blood sacrifice like the rest. He also said he held no ill will towards the English officers or soldiers. The most interesting part was when he revealed to Aine, quote, "My cold exterior was but a mask." It seems like it was just a tough guy act all along. And as a Christian like the rest, he also wrote, quote, "I hope to see God's face, even for a moment, in the morning," end quote. He was allowed a visit from his sister and brothers late Sunday night. His brother Michael later wrote, quote, "He received us and shook hands quite calmly, and after a word or two, put his arm around Aine, bent down with a sweet smile and kissed her lovingly." Eamonn said goodbye to the group, who then sent for Father Augustine, and he had communion again. Father Augustine lent him his crucifix, and Ceannt held it when he was shot down at 34 years old. Father Augustine will later tell the story of Ceannt's martyrdom in a speech in America 3 years later, describing Ceannt as a, quote, "poor, sweet, gentle soul, the dying saint." Ceannt may have been a very serious man, but he was not malicious. He was well loved and respected by everyone who crossed his path. Ceannt deserved better.